Welcome everyone to our second Parlour Lab with Carol Gosam and Deirdre Brown. I'm so excited to have everyone here today because today we're gathered all across the world. I'm speaking to you from the University of Queensland campus in Meanjin, also known as Brisbane in Australia. And I'd like to acknowledge the Turrbal and the Yagara people as the custodians of the lands that I have the honour of living and working in, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Further, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands and waters of Australia, because we're gathered all across Australia and across the world. And in Australia, where sovereignty was never ceded, and pay my respect to all First Nations elders, past, present and emerging, including those in the audience today. So thank you everyone so much for being here. We're so thrilled to have Carol and Deirdre with us today to talk both locally and globally about their research on Indigenous architecture. Carol is a lecturer at the University of Queensland and Deirdre is the head of the Architecture and Planning School at the University of Auckland. And both are having a huge influence, not only in a research space, but also on practice and the next generations of architects through teaching and all of their other really exciting projects. I'm so thrilled to hear their reflections today. And although it's still an emerging norm, the inclusions of Indigenous voices in architectural practice is really starting to become more common in Australia and around the world. So we're really interested in bringing Carol and Deirdre together today to discuss how Indigenous protocols can influence architectural learning, research practice, and wider society. And I'm particularly looking forward to the discussion today about how and where Indigenous protocols might clash with Western standards in research, and how this illuminates spaces where we really need to change and start challenging stereotypical views that we hold, and use this process to really enrich our research outcomes, but also our built environment to create better, more meaningful, inclusive and ecologically healthier places to live. So thank you everyone for joining us. Before we introduce Carol and Deirdre, I'm just going to hand over to Macarena to go through some housekeeping for today's session.
Thanks, Callie. And I'll stop sharing the slide there so that we can all see our faces better. Hi, I'm Macarena de la Vega, and I am a postdoc research fellow at the University of Melbourne, and serve at least until next week as communications manager of the Society of Architectural Historians of Australia and New Zealand, SAHANS, one of the collaborators of this series. Just a second of advertising here. Just this Wednesday, we're starting our annual conference online, organized by the University of Western Australia, and just have a look at our website if you're interested in participating. But now the Zoom protocols. As always, please make sure your microphone is on mute unless you're actually speaking. Please leave your camera on if you can, just like we are right now. If we experience any Zoom glitches or technical problems, we will ask you all to please turn your cameras off and see if that helps, because we're really thrilled to have, or anticipate at least, a full house today. As you know, there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions of our speakers. So if you have a question, please just put it in the chat section. We will choose some of these questions and invite you to ask them live to our speakers. So if for whatever reason, if you're at work and you just can't speak up, just let us know in the chat that you would rather us pose these questions on your behalf. And we may not be able to go to all the questions today, but they do help inform future events and plans.
Thanks, Maca. It's so great to have a full house today. I'm Carly Marnane, if I haven't met you all before, and I'm a practicing architect, but I'm also finishing my PhD, hopefully submitting this week, on the architecture of informal settlements in India. But today I'm thrilled to announce our first speaker, Carol. Carol Gosam descends from the Turrbal Bama peoples in Gumbalbara country on the Herbert and Tully water basins in North Queensland. Carol graduated in the late 1990s as the first Indigenous woman from Queensland to complete an architecture degree, and now she is a lecturer in the School of Architecture at the University of Queensland. She's in high demand for writing, research, education, consultation and design practice, and Carol's work looks at Indigenous architecture and where it intersects with public, civic, social, institutional architecture and identity themes. And she has professional experiences in rural townships in far north Queensland, the Northern Territory and Southeast Queensland. I've had the honour of teaching with Carol for the last few semesters, and something that I really appreciate and that's really apparent in her work is a much more holistic thinking about architecture, and not just as the resulting building object, but the whole process that comes well before the building takes shape and well after it is being built. And I'm really thankful that she's here with us today to talk about writing, thinking indigeneity and land. So thanks for being here, Carol, and welcome.
Thank you, Carly. Thank you very much to the Parlour community and the Parlour organisers for inviting me today. So I thought what I would start with was just talking about, I guess, some of the points that I'm going to make, and it's around a series of themes or topics, I guess. And essentially it's confined to my experiences, observations and participation in Indigenous housing research and infrastructure research, not necessarily on quite other specific medical or culturally sensitive research themes. So some of the things I'm going to talk about, I hope you can sort of adapt to recognise that what I'm talking about in that comes from that framework. So I wanted to touch on, I guess, academic research frameworks involving ethics, Indigenous people as subjects, and working as an Indigenous researcher on other people's countries. Also talking about research agendas and methods. And so I wanted to end with a point, I guess, about unintended consequences of research. So under the theme, the first theme, I guess, I wanted to talk about was assumptions in ethics application. So I'm going to just go quite specific to a research process here. I'm assuming that some of the audience may be familiar with this process, particularly in university settings, of having ethics applications either for PhDs or other research projects. And often we know that the assumed goal of research ethics committees are to protect potential participants in research by taking into account their potential risks and benefits, either of the research to the community or individuals where the research is going to be carried out. So the point I would like to make is it's not ethical if Indigenous values are not incorporated into that process of ethics. Ethics are essentially framed and based on Western assumptions about what constitutes ethics. So in the research context, when anyone participates in an Indigenous setting, there needs to be, mindful that, for example, I wanted to illustrate this with Indigenous peoples have varied economic circumstances. And so one of the things that is considered in Western research methodology is about the payment of interviewees for their work, that this somehow, under the Western research model, is embedded with assumptions that payments for participant times taints the research outcome. It also considers that this excludes acknowledgements that researchers are often paid and their contribution to the research process is not tainted somehow, but the subject is tainted. So the assumption that of this idea, I guess, is that participants who are motivated by financial reward would possibly invent stories, not to meet the expectations of the researcher. But in Indigenous contexts, I guess I wanted to highlight that my experience has been that poverty is a huge barrier for Indigenous people, for many, a large percentage of Indigenous people, for effective participation in any process, be it research or consultation. And so speaking from experience, the majority, for example, of my Indigenous family do not have readily disposable resources or funds to engage meaningfully in processes they would like to be involved in. So without compensatory payments for research or consultation, that places a burden on sparse economic resources. So I'm not going to try and sort of address every scenario, but that's just one point I wanted to make. I guess the other one, the other second point that I wanted to talk about and touch on is Indigenous subjects and the assumptions of vulnerability and lack of agency. So ethics research committees both define, speak on behalf and judge research applications on the basis of vulnerability of the subjects. So Indigenous peoples have equally contributed to this complicated space, and in some instances Indigenous academic leaders have argued that all Indigenous subjects are at risk from the harm of research, and have argued for tighter measures of control, which would eventually, if implemented, possibly shut down all research. And so that's something to consider. Another theme, I guess, it's a point that I make without actually making a definitive conclusion on that, but I'm happy to address questions because I can talk to quite specific examples where this is coming from. The next point I would like to make is Indigenous researchers working on other people's countries, asking about other Indigenous people's business or countries. So as we know that any space that you go into, whether it's Indigenous or otherwise, it's historically, socially, culturally and politically loaded spaces. And for both outsiders who constitute both Indigenous people like myself and non-Indigenous people, you have to really work hard to build rapport, trust, just like any other context or human relationship. And so researchers have to demonstrate that Indigenous communities' voice will be heard, compensated and respected in order to build trust with Indigenous subjects. And I wanted to give an example, like quite a couple of examples. I guess I have a colleague, a really long-time friend who works in Central Australia. She works across multiple Indigenous peoples' countries. She did a PhD about the transfer of ecological knowledge from elders to young people. She describes herself in her PhD as a reluctant Indigenous ethnographer who had to work out what same culture ethnography meant in actual practice. And for my friend, it involved navigating, for example, a concept which is quite sort of familiar in remote Indigenous contexts and sometimes in urban contexts, is the concept of shame. Being what she describes as a shame researcher. So by her definition, she explains that shame is characterised as a public presentation of self on behalf of Indigenous people that is devoid of egotism, selfishness and individuality. And as you will note from those sort of, that concept of shame, that encapsulates, and perhaps shame's an inadequate word, but this is what Indigenous people use. It involves essentially a heightened sensitivity on the part of Indigenous researchers, not making demands on people's times and presupposing that the researchers' interests match the interests of the people. And I would say shame also is an example of a tension between group identity and individual identity values. And it's not to be assumed that all Indigenous people hold a group identity, but in certain contexts, this is heightened. And so Douglas, my friend, talks about modernists, Aboriginal modernists who see shame as backward or regressive. So she argues that shame is intrinsically connected to Indigenous concepts of moral behaviour and certainly plays out in certain contexts in a heightened way. And another example, I guess, I wanted to illustrate with is other Indigenous research contexts outside of Australia. I had an architectural student who had a Pacific Australian background. She was doing research on her own family in the Pacific Island. The student was fluent in the local language and had strong cultural connections, although she was based in Australia. Her research topic was on bush kitchens and involved documenting bush kitchens and their place in the cooking of bush foods for family gatherings, funerals, weddings, homecomings, a whole range, and also economic enterprise. So her research ethics application was rejected on the basis that she wanted to publish her research. But after several attempts, she was granted her research ethics application, which involved working with her own family and extended kin, which it was granted on the basis that she did not publish the work, even though she attempted to demonstrate that the desire was for her family and herself to have the work published. So the ethics committee conveyed that despite her connections to family, they presume that her family would feel obligated to participate and may not feel inclined to withdraw consent because of those familial connections. So it's becoming a very complicated space even for Indigenous researchers to operate in. Okay, so another thing I would like to talk about is research agendas often mismatch the concerns of Indigenous peoples. So Western research models are based on novel research. Essentially, the intention is that we don't restate ongoing human suffering or precarity, particularly in the context of Aboriginal housing and Aboriginal housing needs, or so-called wicked problems. So on a recent project, I was involved in reporting on how the lack of housing maintenance may or may not be causally linked to the spread of infectious disease. I found that the rigid research model that required under the Western frameworks was unable to flexibly adjust to the concerns of the householder, which were not about infectious disease spread, but other states of disrepair of their houses. Their concerns didn't match the predetermined model of being attentive to infectious disease transmissions, either through household crowding and the state of disrepair of household fittings and fixtures. What they were concerned about, were other things that really touched on health, but not infectious health. So methodologically, we were required to ignore householders reporting on the state of disrepair of their floors, light fittings, window fittings, and so forth. For example, large holes in the floor due to inadequate footing designs, poor construction methods and poor material choices had to be ignored because it didn't fit under the framework of infectious disease. But these were the major concerns of the householders. So you can imagine that as researchers, you can't go back then and reuse that research without a lot of work to reframe it to highlight that issue. Because first of all, Indigenous housing is described certainly in academia and in certain spheres as an old problem that we've all heard about, and we're really not interested in hearing again that Indigenous people are still having issues with household crowding. We're wanting to hear the new and the novel. So that was a really concerning thing that I felt really conflicted with through that research, and particularly in the attempt to publish it. You have to be aware that, finally, that research may be used to add to Indigenous burdens rather than alleviate. And this was something that I became painfully aware of in housing research on Indigenous mobility and household crowding. When I was working on other research projects and having to do the background literature research, I noticed that government and Indigenous housing agencies and housing agencies were attempting to enforce reductions in household occupants. And most of the government policy was driven by agendas to mitigate or socially engineer Indigenous households based on deficit models of Indigenous peoples. However, these higher level policies were driven by the research that was designed to actually help and expose the issue of Indigenous household crowding and mobility and how it plays into housing context and a whole range of other things. So I guess they're the you know, five things that I wanted to touch on, and I'm happy to address questions afterwards, but I'll hand over now back to our hosts.
Thank you, Carol. That was great. That was great. Lots of questions already. Not yet in the chat. Just remember that you can use it for the questions, but definitely in my notebook. But now it is my turn to introduce Deirdre Brown. She's Maori and Pakeha descent. She teaches design and history and is a professor and head of school head of School of Architecture at the University of Auckland. Her specialist teaching, supervisory, and research interests are in the fields of Maori and Pacific architectural and art history, and the broader discipline of Indigenous design. She has written several books, including the multi-authored Art in Oceania, A New History of 2012, and Maori Architecture of 2009, and curated a number of exhibitions in galleries around the country, New Zealand that would be. She's currently a member of the Auckland branch of the New Zealand Institute of Architects, the Maori Trademarks Advisory Committee of the Intellectual Property Office of New Zealand, and Minimum Standards Working Group of the Register Architects Board, as well as an assessor for the Science Investment Round of the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. She's also a member of Sahans and was the editor of its journal Fabrications between 2003 and 2007. It is really great to welcome you, Deirdre, today. She's joining us from Auckland, and she'll talk to us about architecture of the people and their land. Thank you.
Kia ora. Thank you, Macarena. May I ask you if you could share my PowerPoint, please? Ko mātātua te waka, ko Ngāpuhi te iwi, ko Ngāti Rehia te hapu, ko Mangaiti te marae, ko Deirdre Brown tāku ingoa. Thank you, Macarena and Carly, for your very kind invitation to speak with my esteemed colleague, Carol Gosam, a great friend of mine, on the topic of architecture on Indigenous lands. I'd also like to acknowledge the important work of PALA, which is the Trans-Tasman sister organisation of Architecture and Women New Zealand, of which I am also a member. So kia ora koutou. Next slide, please. So my pepeha, or my Māori introduction at the beginning, explains who I am in terms of where I come from the land. So I'm a descendant of Polynesian migrants who sailed to New Zealand on the Mātātua Waka, or voyaging canoe, about 800 years ago. And from these ancestors and many other canoes that came to form the tribes and sub-tribes of Aotearoa, New Zealand. And my tribal background is that I'm both Ngāpuhi and Ngāti Kahu from the northern part of New Zealand. And particularly from the northern Bay of Islands and also the Whangaroa Harbour, which you can see on this image here. In 2014, the Waitangi Tribunal found that Ngāpuhi never intended to cede its sovereignty to the British Crown with the signing of the 1840 Treaty of Waitangi. So we are on unceded lands, although like Māori elsewhere, we have suffered from significant land alienation. And I showed two images here. These are both my tribal meeting houses. The one on the left, Te Tiriti, named after the Treaty of Waitangi at Taupo Bay. And on the right, Tauturangi Mārie, named after the end of the First World War at Mangaiti Marae in Kaiō, where my brother still lives. And as you can see from them, they're both undecorated Māori meeting houses. They don't feature the same carvings and decorations that you might see elsewhere in the country. And this was something for me coming from this area and then coming to the School of Architecture and Planning and learning about carved meeting houses, I kind of thought, well, why were mine different? And this kind of started me on a journey of research. May I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So I've been asked to speak to 3 questions today. What do I do? Why is it relevant? And how do you do it? Which are all intriguing questions. So what do I do? So yes, I do research, and I have done a bit of research over my time. I've been an academic for 23 years, but at the moment I'm the head of a School of Architecture and Planning. So we teach architecture, urban planning, but we also teach urban design and heritage conservation. And this is our building here. We have about 800 students, 38 permanent academic staff, and another sessional 60 staff that come in during the year. There are 3 Māori, of which I am one, and 2 Pacific full-time staff members, and we are currently recruiting for a lecturer, senior lecturer in architecture with a Pacific and South Auckland focus. So I've in this new role, and I'm 2 years into a 5-year term, in many ways I've stopped thinking about my work as something that I do, and I think about my work as something that we do as a school. And this sometimes intersects with my other world, which is the world of my tribe and my sub-tribe. So these are interesting combinations. If we were to think of equity within our staffing profile, we would take our 5 Māori and Pacific staff and have to double them if we were to become the mirror of society that we are supposed to be. So part of my role during this time is to increase Māori and Pacific staff numbers. And there's been a lot of research undertaken recently to show that Māori and Pacific staff tend to sit in the lower ranks of if they've got full-time academic positions. So to actually encourage and support and advance Māori and Pacific staff in this role. And with this new position, this would be the 2nd appointment that we have that would be Pacific focused. A few people have asked, well, why have you put South Auckland as well as part of that focus? South Auckland is a part of Auckland which has a very high Māori and Pacific population. And my feeling is that if the school can do its work to assist in making South Auckland well, then Auckland as well, and Auckland representing 1/3 of the New Zealand population, if Auckland as well, then Aotearoa New Zealand as well. And the other critical factor here is that 17% of the population in my country is of Māori descent. We have an almost equivalent number of Pacific people. These are the only growing cultural populations in Aotearoa New Zealand. So it is absolutely imperative that we do as Indigenous academics and as academics as a whole support the aspirations of the Māori and Pacific communities through our teaching, through our research and through our service to enable these communities to reach their aspirations, but also for the betterment of our country. May I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So here's some of the books that I've published. I'm working on my 8th book at the moment, and I'll talk about that at the end. I was very fortunate that I got into publishing my research quite early in book form. After I finished my PhD in architecture, I spent 6 years teaching Māori art history at the University of Canterbury. I had never studied art history, but I kind of transitioned into that role from architecture. And that's been, I guess, the mainstay of these kind of popular book publications, because Māori art is as a topic, there's a huge amount of interest in it in New Zealand, but also overseas. And I had to publish 4 books on Māori art before my publisher would permit me to publish my book on Māori architecture. I was constantly asking, can I publish in architecture? And they were saying, oh, we don't know if there's a market for this. And so I wrote these other books. They did okay. And they said, okay, well, you can have a go at a Māori architecture book. And it was kind of a conversion of my PhD plus some of the other research that I had been doing. And I remember I came up with the title Māori Architecture, and the feedback that I got was that the book publishers said that it didn't mean anything. It was a term that was meaningless. It was like calling it Māori rocket design or something like that. I think that was what the term that they came up with. It architecture was not a word that belonged with Māori. So I can see that he's in the audience for today's presentation. I quoted back Mike Austin as establishing this as a field of study, and eventually got them to use that as the title of the book, and things moved on from there. But it is actually quite difficult to communicate out Indigenous architecture to the wider public when it is seen as being part of other art forms. I have also, as Macarena mentioned, published or been part of a team that published a book on oceanic art, and in perhaps the early to mid part of my career, I thought that that was something that I could do. I was already working in the realm of Māori, and that I would, as you do, you internationalize your research by expanding out to other places. But I guess this was also my swan song at the same time, because I became acutely aware that actually what my role is to open a pathway for other Pacific scholars who are from those parts of the region that I had been writing about, and enable them to write about them instead. So I've worked to support them in their aspirations as researchers. May I have the next slide, please? So why is this work relevant? I'll talk a little bit about my teaching. So my teaching sits within Indigenous and I guess the Māori paradigm. And I feel very strongly that settlement and self-determination are inextricably linked. So all the work that we do within the School of Architecture is about settlement. We are designing buildings to settle on the whenua, on the land. And I feel very strongly that it is our role as design educators and as practitioners to honour the land, to honour its stories, and to understand what has occurred here. Now I'm talking about a 700 to 800 year history in Aotearoa, New Zealand. You know, Carol's people have been living on the whenua for 40,000 years plus, which is in such a deep engagement with land. You know, questions that I'm often asking of the students is, how do we honour the whenua? How do we honour the land? Through architectural design. And there are many different ways in which we can explore this. In terms of my research, my colleagues and I are working in the area of Māori art and architectural research. We have a responsibility, we feel, to investigate, recover and communicate knowledge about Māori architecture to primarily assist Māori communities in their aspirations, and to enable the next generation of architects and architectural designers who may be from more diverse backgrounds with theirs too. I have noticed a shift when I came through, and I was very lucky to have the supervision of Mike Austin and Mike Lindsay when I was doing my PhD. The focus on Indigenous architectural studies was in the history realm, but I have seen over the years this change. And I'm increasingly working more within the fields that Carol was talking about in terms of community well-being and community design. So that's a shift that I've seen in recent years. And I guess in some ways, and you know, I can say this as a SAHANS member, it's how do we keep history relevant? How do we keep history relevant in an age when you can find anything about any architect or building just by simply doing a Google search on your phone. Next slide, please. So how do I do this? So thinking in terms of my headship, what I've been doing is enhancing our currently excellent programs, ensuring our staff are well supported and helping to advance them in their careers, but looking specifically at ensuring that our curriculum and our research is both industry and socially relevant. And I guess this is where I can bring my research background in to bear with my service role at the university. Is how is the work that we are doing in the Māori and Pacific space relevant to communities? What is it that communities want? And the first step has been actually engaging with iwi Māori tribes, working with them think about their aspirations. So often and for so long, the university has worked in what Carol has described in so eloquently as deficit models. You know, how do we pick people up? You know, Māori are at the so-called bottom of the ladder, but actually the university forgets that we live in sub-tribes and tribes, and actually those are the units through which we should be working. May I have my next slide, please? So like many of us in 2020, COVID-19 ate my research this year. And it's been very difficult to find time to do research. And I saw Paul Memmott is in the audience. And Paul, I do have that chapter coming to you, which I know is due by close of business today. You know, I'm very lucky because when I did do my history studies, they were in late 19th and early 20th century Māori architecture, and most of the built infrastructure on Māori marae, which is part of our community infrastructure, does come from that age. So I still work on establishing the pūrākau, or stories of Māori art and architectural histories, and this is a work, it's been a long time coming, 8 years, writing a full history of Māori art and architecture with my colleague Ngarino Ellis from Art History, and then wanting to communicate that through publication, community, industry events and government advice. And more recent work has been working on marae resilience projects with a National Centre of Research Excellence called QuakeCore. So looking at how our architectural infrastructure on marae stands up against natural disasters. I have been undertaking wellbeing research very similar to what Carol was describing, but primarily in my current role, it's enabling others in the field, particularly students, to take on these research roles. Kia ora koutou, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Deirdre, for that really informative talk. I really enjoyed hearing both you and Carol speak. And you both talked a little bit about kind of intersectionality and how when you're going through these research processes, lots of different kind of issues and conditions intersect. And I was wondering if that has resulted in something that was really surprising or something that you weren't expecting to come out of your research, either positive or negative. I don't know who wants to speak to that first.
Well, if I may start, I think, you know, when I think about my research, and this includes the art research as well, which is object-based, but a surprising thing is that how much I underestimated how this research brings communities together and how valued it is. So I recently worked on the repatriation of a taonga, or a Māori treasure, very, very small item that we repatriated from Australia. And it enabled two sub-tribes to come together that had been apart for over 200 years. And I've still to this day, I can't believe that the work I and a couple of others did on this actually made an event like that happen. Similarly with architectural research and around particularly the conservation of marae buildings and their resilience. You look at them and you're just in awe of them because they're over 100 years old, but you know that the work that you're doing with the communities on them will enable them to stand for another 100 years. And then you think about the number of people that will engage with that building and the transformation that will occur in their lives accordingly. So I feel very much that as academics we're privileged, not in the sense of in a way that you know, we shouldn't be in the roles that we do, but we're privileged because we get to be the conduit for these types of unexpected events to occur.
Carol, you're on mute.
All right. Yeah, I guess I just wanted to mention, I guess a surprising outcome for me is sometimes I'm even surprised when the Indigenous voice from the community does become, you know, treated in a research context, and how it sort of could can redirect and drive research focus and emphasis, you know, in a slightly different direction. And there's always really surprising outcomes, because I'm not familiar and intimate with every Indigenous community that we're working with. And so, you know, some of the, when Indigenous voices are really heard through that process of research, and as Deirdre so eloquently said too, about, you know, Indigenous Māori being really fully engaged in that process and really being quite proud of being their participation. I think when Indigenous people take ownership of that process and really fully engage with it, then you know that that actually your processes and methods are working. A huge hint is when Indigenous people use the most common method of withdrawal from a process, you know you're really in trouble. So, and it's the most powerful gesture of really disengaging from a process that they really don't feel like they're being fully participating in.
And how do you feel that the current, I guess, process of research, does it allow, and does the ethics, you talked a little bit about it, but how does that support or hinder, I suppose, the ability for us to move as the research participants get involved? Have you found that process to kind of thwart your efforts to move with them, or have you just found a way to get around it afterwards?
Well, I mean, I guess a lot of people are aware that a lot of research agendas are not actually driven by communities. They're driven by funding agencies, and they're often government. And so often the agendas are focused on social engineering, right? And so social engineering of Indigenous communities, particularly in the welfare space or the housing space. And so it is constantly framed under this deficit model. And so I think the trick is that when you actually do engage with Indigenous communities, you often find that their emphasis, they're concerned about some of those things, and there may be overlap, but they also may be concerned about things that the research funding agencies are not attentive to. And I think that's a huge tension in research. And I think ideally what you would like is it not to be, the agenda not to be driven by funding agencies, but actually Indigenous communities having an opportunity to be able to sort of define what they would like research on. And so some of it is in social advocacy, some of it is in not things that are often really valued and framed within research contexts, by funding agencies. So I think ideally, I've always had this ideal sort of thing. What we would do is that you would go to, a community that you have a deep relationship, actually have time to sit down and work with them on what they would like research on. And then actually you might find that there are variances within the community, the Indigenous community, and even townships, or even between remote and very remote. And so that you could adapt the flexibility and have some time to really work on the ground to find out, and then have an opportunity to reframe that back, rather than it being driven by this sort of funding model that focuses on particular research themes that are supposedly driven by, Indigenous people, which in reality we know they're not.
Sorry,
I was just going to, that's okay. I was just going to build on what Carol said. I guess one of the advantages of the disadvantage of working in a New Zealand environment is that we have so little money for public good funding of research. We don't have the same social engineering pressures on where our research lies. But one issue that we do have with a growing body of Māori and Pacific researchers is that we're seeing increasingly that pool of highly talented people being put onto research grants as contractors or associate investigators, and never as principal investigators. So you've got people building whole careers that are working at that level of research, but never being able to move up, and thus never getting the advantages of being able to drive their own research agendas. So one thing that we've been talking about amongst the Māori staff in the university is the importance of Indigenous researchers leading their own projects, and also the importance of them saying no to other projects. You know, there's these subtle pressures of very kind colleagues that you work with, come and be the Indigenous representative on my project about whatever, and you've never thought about it before, but you know, they've got all the money, you get on it, you don't get any of the glory at the end, and they could have never done the project without you. And their careers move on and yours don't. So there's a movement amongst Māori researchers, and a growing movement amongst Pacific researchers too, to be the determiners of, from the academic perspective, of what the research should be. And that fits in with what Carol says, is that our research processes, our kaupapa Māori research processes, is to talk to communities and let the communities tell us what their needs are, and then us as Indigenous researchers lead those projects.
Yeah. Now, I'm just going to follow on what you were just saying, Deidre, because I did want to, you know, point out how important in both your talks, both agency and enabling, you know, both your buzzwords, I would say. And I'm just going to open up to the community, because I wanted to pose the question about how do we bring this to practice, but I think Ree Walker can actually do that as well. Ree, if you don't mind unmuting yourself and posing your question.
Kia ora, Deirdre and Carol. I'm a practicing architect in Melbourne of Māori descent, and I have hit this point where you can't access the Indigenous knowledge required. There's not enough of a pool there, I guess, to support the direction of your design and practice. I recognise the limitations of that. I maintain a close eye on the New Zealand industry, and I see that there's certainly more progress there. And I think my question really is around that cultural intellectual property as we move into the commercial space as a practicing architect. So you can have the best of intentions. Myself as an Indigenous designer, I have the best of intentions to incorporate that, but accessing that with a small pool of Indigenous designers, I think puts a lot of pressure onto that small pool of resource. As you're talking, it sounds like there is a way we could maybe turn the research around to work a bit better in that way. But yeah, I guess I'm just interested in that intellectual property that that we should be trying to access as practitioners.
Kia ora, Ree. It's lovely to see you virtually. So thank you for your question. Can I just go back with a question? So are you thinking more in terms of the cultural properties that you're dealing with? And when you mean access, do you mean access as in finding the knowledge, or access as in being allowed to use the knowledge and reinterpret it in other meaningful ways?
In the work I do, public architecture, it's not often in at the briefing phase. So it's something that as a practitioner you need to sort of drive forward with, but then accessing the specific people is very difficult as well. And commercial, once you're practicing, it's so time poor that on a lot of projects it's so difficult to incorporate. And I guess from a educational perspective, seeing what the University of Auckland is doing is really heartening. But yeah, even accessing that intellectual property to incorporate into projects is, yeah, very difficult, I find here.
I could, just to answer you, Ree, because I guess in your context as a practitioner, you're trying to sort of intersect with, you know, Indigenous practitioners who come from architecture. I found that there's lots of, there's lots of ways to engage with that if there is an opportunity to do that in the commercial realm. Like there's a larger body of Indigenous artists and so forth who've really developed quite fruitful and really interesting relationships with architects to incorporate, you know, Indigenous art themes in not just as sort of paintings on walls or pieces of art, but integrate that into architecture. So, you know, we've got sort of some quite recent examples with small buildings or small projects like the, you know, Edition office and work with, you know, Indigenous artists and so forth for the Victorian sort of, what is it, the project In Absence, you know, Edition office's project In Absence, and also its other one for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander War Memorial in Canberra. So there, I mean, yeah, there is a too small, the pool for Indigenous architects is very, very small. And so, and it's also relationships with Indigenous organisations, other sort of Indigenous practitioners across a range of other fields that can be really quite fruitful as well, you know. So, you know, having, I think engaging with Indigenous organisations or land councils or different other bodies might actually assist in that process. And so when you engage, you know, meet Indigenous makers, that's when the richness of a project can become apparent. And it doesn't necessarily mean, I think, that you have to have this exhaustive consultation process, but you can have these quite fruitful partnerships that can sort of lead on to flow-on effects for, you know, Indigenous makers.
Thank you for that, Carol. I had a question that sort of leads on from that, beyond sort of engaging with Indigenous practitioners, sort of about engaging with Indigenous communities and the tension between individual and community identity. And we have someone in the audience, Netchal Narula, who had a question that was quite similar. So Netchal, would you be able to unmute yourself and ask that question to our speakers?
Hello everyone, my name is Nachal. I've recently completed my master's from Deakin University, and this is something that I came across from my own experience. So with regards to Carol's discussion on how Indigenous researchers have to deal with complexities on first getting their research approved, then doing the research, and in the longer run, getting it published. So if a non-Indigenous researcher, because Australia is now getting students and researchers from diverse backgrounds, so in case a non-Indigenous researcher is interested in doing some research related to Indigenous communities, which definitely involves interacting with them, so how can they approach this aspect of the research? Because it can be certainly overwhelming to see that the Indigenous researchers who are so close to the land, they are having to go through the struggle of doing their research and then getting it published. So what would be your suggestions and advice for non-Indigenous researchers who are interested in doing some research regarding or which involves Indigenous communities?
So if I may, I think aligning yourself with a community or elders as soon as practicable within one's research project, you know, in terms of shaping the project. What I found very useful, and this was very much at the early part of my research journey when I was doing my PhD, was that I had a couple of people who, you know, in those days you didn't have email, I had to write letters to them, who took me on and took on what I was doing and introduced me to other people. And it was through those introductions, the fact that they were introducing me, and this was even me as an Indigenous researcher, that built trust. You know, so it's about making those connections to the community having the ability to shape your research. And often when we're in the early to mid part of our research careers, we get more out of those interactions than the communities necessarily get back. Helps to give your research integrity. and builds a profile for you accordingly as someone who can work with the community. Carol, you might have more to add here.
Oh, no, I totally agree with what Deirdre says, because it's essentially it's about building relationships. And I think people will question your motives when you just sort of suddenly turn up and say, I want to, really start working with you, because it then becomes about you presenting your agenda rather than, trying to frame it and allow a slow time to really build trust and relationships. And I think, a lot of that I often hear back from Indigenous communities and the frustrations, particularly with particular communities, even with projects that are designed to develop that really communities need, is a frustration with the preceding processes. And so you may be on the end of sort of a very unwelcome sort of process, so I think if you can sort of put your fear aside and really work repeatedly on building trust in a community or with a community organisation, and really start from something that is embedded with Indigenous people and not have a preset agenda and say, I'd really like to research this, that or the other, but actually then, as Deirdre said, have your research reframed by the community. They may not be interested at all in your research topic, and so or your particular agenda. So yeah, I think that really helps, and I think where those relationships are built by people who have a longevity working with Indigenous communities, they really understand that process of allowing time to build those relationships and therefore and ensure that you have a process and where Indigenous voice is recognised, that you understand that there may be protocols that are fine in a research context or a Western context that may not be incredibly offensive in an Indigenous context. So yeah, it's and do a lot of reading before you go to a community. Don't expect them to train you. You need to inform yourself first. It's not the community's responsibility to carry you through this journey. It's your responsibility to do a lot of background research, reading, and inform yourself, before you embark on that.
Thank you so much. Thanks for your question, and thank you both for your comments. We're coming very close to the hour. I was wondering if you would have, both of you briefly, if you could think of something that you would like practitioners to know, to think about, from what you've shared with them. What is it as, Aboriginal woman and a Maori woman, what is it that you would want practitioners to have in mind when they, work with the land?
I think, in working with Indigenous communities, it's not, that there are Indigenous processes and methods in the way that people relate to land, but when you're working in complex spaces, like most of us are living in cities, that there are Indigenous leaders who are not traditional owners, who have a long historical association, and that their voice is equally respected by traditional owners as well, and to engage people as broadly in that process. I think I'm finding a method of just working with traditional owners is perhaps a fraught one in an urban context, and so that you have to both respect both traditional owners as well as Indigenous organisations that may be made up of a range of people who are working in a place and are off country but have a very great respected role in the community.
I completely agree with what Carol has just shared, and the only thing that I'd have to add is in those kinds of engagements, go in being prepared to listen rather than talk. I've seen it too many times, people going in, there's a situation, I can think of one recently of an important Māori building that is in dire need of some restoration work, and a whole bunch of architects turned up and started talking at the community as to what they should be doing with their building, when really the approach was to go there and be quiet and to listen to the stories, listen to what they have to say. You know, they are their own resource, and engage with that. So I just share, go prepared to listen rather than to talk.
That's such fantastic advice. Thank you so much, Deirdre and Carol. That brings us to 1 o'clock, so that's our time to wrap up.
That's in Brisbane. Depends where you are.
Yes, oh my gosh, everyone's all over the world, so, but we have to wrap up because it's an hour. Also, if anyone's interested in some more information on some fantastic people to follow, recently, the last week for NAIDOC Week on Parla, Parla's been featuring some really fantastic Indigenous women working in the built environment, and they've got their own Instagram feed called Deadly Duruman. I hope I pronounced that correctly. So if anyone's interested, you can follow that account, and that will link you to lots of really fantastic people and more information. So that brings us to the end. Please be in touch if you'd like to get involved with this series. We're very happy to welcome all new information and new people onto the team. You can join us as a host, or if you'd like to share your research, please get in touch. Thank you so much to the University of Queensland and Sahans for collaborating on this project, UQ for hosting, and thank you to all of Parla's partners who support all of our activities and events. Thank you everyone for being with us, and I think that's a wrap for Parla Lab 2. Thank you so much, Deirdre and Carol, for being with us.